I had barely touched my coffee when the email appeared in my inbox. It was from Mom, and just like everything else she sent, it was short, sharp, and somehow managed to carry both guilt and obligation in a single line. Family dinner this Saturday. Don't be late. I stared at it longer than I should have. Mom and Dad had always had this uncanny ability to turn the simplest of invitations into something heavy, loaded with expectations. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to go. Last time I had tried to really assert myself. At one of their dinners, I had walked out with a storm of accusations hurled at me like knives. My older sister, Emily, sat there smugly, absorbing it all while I fumed silently. I debated. Should I go? Should I call and negotiate my presence? Or should I just ignore it and risk the inevitable guilt trip that would follow? But something in the tone of the email, it was different, urgent, maybe even desperate. Saturday arrived, and despite every fiber of my being telling me to stay home, I found myself driving up the long, winding road to their house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the manicured lawn, and everything about the house looked normal. Too normal. When I walked in, the smell hit me first. Mom's infamous lemon ginger roast, Dad's coffee brewing in the corner, the faint scent of vanilla candles. But it wasn't the smell that made my stomach twist. It was the silence. Emily was already there, smirking as if she had orchestrated this entire scene. Finally, she said, her voice like silk with hidden barbs. We were starting to think you'd chicken out. I forced a smile, trying to brush past the unease creeping up my spine, but the feeling didn't leave. Something was off. Dad, normally a jovial man, had his hands in his pockets, pacing slightly, eyes darting to the clock every few seconds. Mom hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands, her lips pressed tight. Then Dad spoke, and I knew immediately this wasn't a typical family dinner. Sit down, he said, his voice low, almost trembling. We need to talk. All of us. I sat. Emily sat across from me, her posture perfect, a calculated calm in her eyes. Mom and Dad flanked her, and in that moment, I realized, whatever this was, it was going to change everything. The silence lingered longer than I expected. Dad cleared his throat, and I noticed a tension in his shoulders that I'd never seen before. Mom's eyes were fixed on the table, fingers tapping nervously. Emily, of course, was poised and calm, though there was a glint in her eyes that made my stomach churn. Something happened, Dad finally said. Something serious, and we think it's time you knew. I froze, heart thudding. Knew what? My voice sounded small, cautious, like stepping onto thin ice. Mom finally looked up, her face pale. It's about the family business, she whispered. About the money, about you. My mind raced. The family business had been in our lives forever, a bakery chain that Dad had started from nothing. I had worked there for years, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and even relationships. And now, I had no idea what was coming. Emily leaned forward, her calm demeanor now a mask for something sharper. You were supposed to know this eventually, she said, her tone almost teasing. But it seems like, well, it can't wait any longer. Dad sat down heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. We made a decision, he said, voice breaking slightly. A month ago, we let you go. I blinked. What? You're fired, Emily said flatly, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. We decided it was time for new management. Your ideas, your innovations, they weren't what the business needed. I laughed because I had to. Wait, you fired me? You, my own parents, fired me? For what reason? Mom's eyes welled up. It's about the budget, the future. We thought it was best. You're talented, yes, but you destroyed everything I built here. I shouted, my voice shaking. I gave this company my life. And then the real bombshell dropped. Dad swallowed hard. It wasn't just the business. We've been under financial strain. And, well, you might not believe this, but we didn't know how else to save it. I sat there, reeling. Every word they spoke felt like betrayal. Every glance Emily gave was a reminder that she had somehow been in on this plan, watching me, waiting. For a moment, I felt the world tilt. My family, my safe space, the people I trusted most, had all turned against me. And the worst part? I had no idea if it was temporary, a mistake, or something permanent. Am I the asshole for being angry? I whispered to myself, though the answer felt obvious. I stormed out of the dining room, slamming the door behind me. The sound echoed through the house like a warning. My chest was tight, every breath sharp and bitter. I couldn't process what had just happened. My parents, the people who raised me, had fired me. My sister, the one I'd trusted my whole life, had watched it unfold like some sort of spectator sport. I retreated to my old bedroom, though it didn't feel like mine anymore, and sank onto the bed. The walls seemed smaller, oppressive, as if they, too, were judging me. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from friends asking if I was okay. Calls I ignored. None of them could understand. How could they? They hadn't been blindsided by their own family. Eventually, Emily appeared at the door, her posture calm but her eyes sharp, measuring. "You can't just leave," she said. "We need to talk." I laughed bitterly. "Talk? You mean, explain why you stabbed me in the back?" She flinched slightly at my words but didn't back down. "It wasn't like that. You don't understand everything we're dealing with. You think firing you was easy? It wasn't." I narrowed my eyes. "Oh, I'm sure it was just painful. For you. Not for me, the one who built the business from the ground up." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Look, I know you're hurt, and I get it. But Dad and Mom, they're scared. The business is on the edge. If we didn't make this decision, we could have lost everything. And I mean everything. Our house, the bakery, our lives as we know them." I shook my head. "So the solution was to fire me without warning? To humiliate me?" "You weren't fired to humiliate you," she said quietly. We were trying to protect you. And us. We didn't know how else to handle it." I laughed again, but this time it was hollow. "Protect me? From what? From the truth that you don't trust me?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the window like tiny reminders that life was still moving, whether I was ready or not. I realized, in that moment, that nothing would ever feel the same. My sense of family, of loyalty, of trust, everything had shifted. And the thought that struck me most sharply? I couldn't stay here, not like this. I had to fight back. Not out of spite, not to prove them wrong, but to reclaim what was mine. I left the room, grabbing my coat. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in a house where betrayal had been served at the dinner table. And as the rain soaked through my hair and clothes, I swore to myself that I would find a way to turn this around. Because if my family thought this was the end of my story, they were very wrong. I spent the night wandering the streets, letting the rain soak through my coat. Each step was heavy with anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of determination. By the time I returned to my apartment, my mind was made up. I wasn't going to sit back and let my parents' decisions destroy everything I had built. The next morning, I began the painstaking work of assessing what I could do. I had connections within the company, vendors who trusted me, longtime employees who respected me. They weren't just workers. They were the lifeblood of the bakery, and I knew I could count on them to keep the operation afloat even in the chaos my family had created. I started with small calls, discreet messages to key staff. "Don't worry," I said, careful with my tone. "We'll get through this. Just follow my lead for now." There was hesitation, a touch of fear, but I could hear loyalty and trust in their voices. It was the first spark of hope I'd felt since the night of the dinner. Next, I examined the finances. My parents had always been careful with appearances, but behind the glossy reports and cheerful smiles, the cracks were visible. They had been taking risks, cutting corners, and now the company teetered on the brink of collapse. My heart sank, not because I cared about the money, but because I cared about the people who depended on it. Then came the plan. I didn't want revenge in the petty sense. I wanted to fix the business, prove that I was the leader they claimed I wasn't. But to do that, I had to step outside the family dynamics entirely. I began reaching out to investors, crafting proposals, gathering allies. I even considered acquiring competitors, strengthening the bakery's position in ways my parents hadn't dared to imagine. All the while, I kept my interactions with Mom, Dad, and Emily minimal. Any contact was polite, neutral, calculated. They didn't realize that every time they celebrated my absence, I was building the very foundation that could eventually surpass them. And then came the first breakthrough. One of the vendors called me, excitement in his voice. "I don't know what you're planning," he said, "but we're with you. We trust you." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I had underestimated how much power came from genuine loyalty, from the relationships I had cultivated over years of sweat and commitment. By the end of the week, I had a clear vision. I wasn't just going to survive this betrayal. I was going to turn it into something that would make my parents and Emily question every single choice they had made against me. And deep down, I felt a spark of satisfaction. Not revenge exactly, but justice in its purest form. For the first time in days, I slept with a sense of purpose instead of bitterness. The storm was far from over, but now I was ready to face it head-on. It didn't take long for my parents to notice that something had changed. At first, it was subtle. Dad's calls became more frequent, filled with a mix of concern and suspicion. Emily's texts were curt, almost hostile, but underneath the sharpness, I could sense a hint of fear. They knew I was no longer the same person they had dismissed so easily. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Mom cornered me one evening, her face pale, eyes wide. You're planning something, aren't you?" she asked, voice trembling. I leaned against the counter, sipping my coffee with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Maybe I am," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But it's nothing personal. I'm just trying to fix what's broken." Mom shook her head, disbelief etched into every line of her face. This isn't how families behave. You're supposed to trust us, to listen." "And I did," I replied, my voice steady. "I trusted you enough to work for this family, to pour years of my life into this business. And this is what I got: fired, humiliated, pushed aside. So forgive me if I'm not taking advice from people who've already made their choice." That night, I could hear Dad pacing in the living room, muffled curses slipping through the door. Emily didn't approach me directly, but I could feel her presence, the silent observation, the calculated watching, like a predator sizing me up. In the following days, I began making small, deliberate moves within the company. I reorganized teams, secured key contracts, and quietly attracted new investors. Each action was a message to my family. I wasn't gone. I wasn't powerless. And I wasn't done. The tension at home became unbearable. Dad tried to reason with me, offering vague promises and excuses. "We just wanted to protect you," he said. "You have to understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my patience finally snapping. "You didn't protect me. You protected yourselves. And now it's too late to pretend otherwise." Emily's expression hardened, her smile gone. "You think this is about money?" she asked, her tone icy. "This is about respect, about tradition, about loyalty." "Respect is earned, Emily," I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "And loyalty isn't demanded, it's given. Something you clearly forgot." By the end of that week, it was clear. The quiet war had begun. Every meeting, every phone call, every conversation was now charged with tension. My family, the very people who were supposed to support me, had become my opponents. And yet, for the first time, I felt alive. I wasn't just reacting. I was strategizing, leading, reclaiming what was mine. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous even. But one thing was clear: I wasn't going to lose without a fight. By now, I had settled into a rhythm. Every morning, I mapped out my next steps. Calls to investors, quiet strategy meetings with loyal employees, reviewing contracts, and looking for opportunities my parents had ignored. The more I dug, the more I realized how fragile the empire they thought they controlled really was. And then, allies began to appear. People who had once been sidelined, underestimated, or ignored now sought me out, whispering about inefficiencies, financial mismanagement, and lost potential. "We've been waiting for someone to step up," one manager said, handing me a list of suppliers ready to negotiate better deals. Another, an older employee who had been with the bakery since its first day, confessed, "I never wanted to go behind your parents' backs, but we need someone competent running this place. That's you." Each alliance strengthened my position. Each whispered word of support reminded me that leadership wasn't just about authority. It was about trust, something my parents had forgotten in their fear-driven decisions. But they were noticing the shifts. Emily's texts became more frequent, veiled with politeness but dripping with tension. Dad started calling less, and when he did, it was to tiptoe around the subject of my plans. Mom oscillated between pleading and lecturing, trying to sway me with emotional appeals. "We only wanted what's best," she would say, but I could hear the panic behind the words. I decided it was time to make a bold move. I began drafting proposals to modernize the business, expand delivery services, and even explore partnerships my parents had rejected outright. Every line in those documents was a quiet signal. The old ways weren't working, and I was ready to take things further. Late one night, I received a surprising call. A former competitor, someone my parents had dismissed as irrelevant, was now offering collaboration. "We've been watching," the voice said. "You have the vision. Let's make something bigger than any of your family could imagine." The temptation to take revenge in a financial sense was strong, but I restrained myself. This wasn't about crushing them. It was about creating something stronger, smarter, and undeniably mine. Meanwhile, the tension at home was unbearable. Emily confronted me one evening, frustration spilling over. "You're changing things behind our backs," she accused. "We can't let you ruin the legacy." I smiled faintly. "I'm not ruining it. I'm saving it from mistakes no one else had the courage to correct." Her glare could have burned through steel. "This isn't over," she said, and left the room like a storm passing through. That night, I realized the battle wasn't just about business. It was about control, trust, and proving that competence mattered more than tradition. And for the first time, I felt that I wasn't just surviving, I was winning. It was no longer subtle. Every interaction with my family became a chess match. Mom's pleading had shifted to thinly veiled threats. "If you continue like this," she warned, "you'll regret turning your back on us." Dad tried to maintain neutrality, but I could see the strain in his eyes. Emily, meanwhile, had become relentless, showing up at meetings, questioning every decision, trying to undermine me without outright confrontation. But I had prepared for this. Every move I made within the company was documented, supported by contracts, and reinforced by the loyalty of the staff. I wasn't just reacting, I was controlling the narrative, and I began to notice cracks in their armor. The first betrayal came from someone I didn't expect, an old family friend who had been advising my parents. He quietly approached me one afternoon. "Your parents don't understand the stakes," he said, lowering his voice. "If you handle this correctly, you can save the company, and maybe even bring the family along." It was a risky alliance, but I took it. Together, we began strategizing ways to stabilize operations while keeping the company financially secure. I also discovered that Emily had been secretly diverting certain resources, trying to maintain leverage over me. The proof was subtle: emails, invoices, minor discrepancies. But it was enough to confront her without alerting Mom and Dad prematurely. When I finally confronted Emily, she didn't deny it. Instead, she smirked, a mix of defiance and curiosity. "I wanted to see if you could really lead," she said. "Turns out, maybe you can." Her words were a jab and a compliment all at once. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let her see that I was unshaken. Leadership wasn't about winning arguments with family. It was about earning results. Meanwhile, the first tangible signs of success emerged. Key investors responded positively to my proposals, Contracts were renegotiated, and the bakery's finances began to stabilize. Employees who had been fearful were now energized, motivated by a leader they trusted. At home, the atmosphere was tense, explosive even. Every conversation was a negotiation, every dinner a battleground. Dad's occasional attempts at diplomacy were ineffective. Mom oscillated between worry and anger. Emily tested me constantly. And yet, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. For the first time since that disastrous dinner, I wasn't the powerless child. They were no longer calling the shots. And the realization hit me hard. The true challenge wasn't the business itself, but navigating a family that had underestimated me in every possible way. By now, the dynamics at home had shifted completely. The bakery, once teetering on the edge of collapse, was stabilizing under my direction. Contracts were secured, employees were motivated, and even a few hesitant investors had decided to place their faith in me. It was quiet progress, but progress nonetheless, and my parents were starting to notice. Dad's calls became more frequent, increasingly desperate in tone. "You're doing good work," he admitted one evening. "But you have to understand, the family, His voice trailed off. I could hear the guilt in his tone, the acknowledgement that he had underestimated me. Mom was harder to read. She oscillated between pleading and confrontation. "We only wanted to protect the family," she said, tears in her eyes. "Can't you see that?" I shook my head. "Protect by firing me? By hiding the truth? That's not protection. That's control." Emily was the most dangerous of all. She had started undermining me subtly, spreading doubts to employees and suppliers, testing the loyalty of my allies. But I had anticipated this. Every meeting, every conversation, every action was strategically calculated. And slowly, cracks began appearing in her confidence. The real turning point came during a board meeting I had arranged, one that included key investors and senior employees. I presented a plan for expansion, innovation, and restructuring, moves that would secure the company's future. The room was silent as I spoke, eyes on me, hanging on every word. When I finished, the response was unanimous. Supportive nods, raised hands, and verbal agreements from people who mattered. Later, I received a text from Emily. "Impressive. Didn't think you had it in you." I smiled, but it was more than satisfaction. It was a signal. The battle wasn't over, but I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just a reactive force. I was a leader, a strategist, someone who could not be ignored. At home, the tension was palpable. My parents no longer attempted to control me overtly. They were cautious, observing, unsure how to navigate this new reality. And Emily, she was calculating, reevaluating her own position, perhaps even considering that our rivalry could shift into a reluctant alliance. That night, I lay awake thinking about the journey so far. Betrayal, anger, strategy, and triumph. The fight had transformed me. I wasn't the powerless child who had been blindsided at the dinner table. I was a force to be reckoned with. And deep down, I knew the final confrontation, the one that would decide the true balance of power, was still ahead. But for the first time, I felt ready. The tension had been building for weeks, and it finally erupted during what would become the most intense family meeting of my life. Mom, Dad, and Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table, their faces a mixture of worry, anger, and disbelief. I could feel every second of anticipation pressing down on me like a physical weight. "I think it's time we address this," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The bakery, the business, our family, everything. This stops being about control and starts being about reality." Dad opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "No excuses. I've seen the numbers. I know what's been happening behind closed doors. And I also know what can save this company, what will save it." Emily leaned back, crossing her arms, eyes sharp. "You think you're the only one who can fix this?" she asked. "We've been running this family for decades. You don't get to decide everything." I shook my head. "It's not about deciding everything. It's about competence. It's about ensuring the business survives and thrives. Something you seem to forget." Mom's voice trembled. We only wanted to protect you, protect us all. You don't understand how much pressure we've been under. I understand perfectly, I said, letting the weight of my words sink in. You protected yourselves at my expense. But that ends now. I presented my plan. Restructuring the management, introducing new investors, and expanding into areas my parents had feared. I had every document, every number, every strategy laid out. The clarity and detail left no room for argument. The turning point came when one of my parents' longtime allies, who had been sitting silently, spoke up. She's right. This plan works. And if we follow it, the company survives. If not, it's gone. Emily's face shifted. First disbelief, then grudging respect. So, you're really doing this, she said quietly. Yes, I said. I am. Not out of revenge. Not out of spite. But to save what matters. And to prove that I can lead. For the first time, the family was silent. There was no arguing, no gaslighting, no attempts to manipulate. The reality was undeniable. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer just a child in their eyes. I was the one steering the ship. And in that silence, I realized something crucial. Leadership wasn't about family loyalty. It wasn't about tradition. It was about trust, competence, and vision. And finally, I had earned it. The weeks that followed the climactic meeting were surreal. The bakery was no longer teetering on the edge. It was thriving. Contracts were solid, employees were motivated, and investors had not only returned but expanded their commitments. Every move I had made was paying off, and the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. At home, the atmosphere was tense but calmer. Dad approached me one evening, his voice quieter than usual. I underestimated you, he admitted, eyes downcast. I thought I knew what was best, but I was wrong. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. It's not about being right, Dad. It's about making the right decisions for everyone involved, including you. Mom followed soon after, her eyes wet but her smile hesitant. I see now. You were never the problem. We were. I'm sorry for not trusting you. Emily's approach was the hardest to predict. She didn't apologize outright. Instead, she offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. You were right, she said. I didn't think you had it in you. I still think you're stubborn as hell, but you led us through this. It wasn't perfect. We weren't suddenly a flawless family. But there was a new understanding, a begrudging respect that had never existed before. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I realized that AITA moments aren't always about clear right or wrong. They're about choices, consequences, and growth. Standing my ground had been painful, exhausting, and lonely, but it had also revealed who I was, and who my family could become when confronted with truth and competence. The bakery continued to flourish, and the family dynamics slowly adjusted. We still argued, still tested boundaries, but there was a newfound recognition. No one could undermine me again without consequences. I had claimed my space, earned my authority, and, in doing so, had redefined what it meant to be a family. Looking back, I understood that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones closest to home. And while the road had been brutal, it had been worth every step. I had lost the illusion of the family I thought I knew, but I had gained something stronger. My own voice, my own leadership, and a future that I was fully in control of. And for that, I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction.